Powell. I'm a software engineer and community organizer who's passionate about making technology like open source more accessible, and I created a meetup group, React Ladies, for women and non-binary React developers. I'm super excited to be here today to share with you how you can use Mdx to supercharge your content creation. But what is Mdx? So you can think of Mdx as having the ability to write JSX inside of Markdown. So when you are using the term Mdx, it can refer to either the syntax of Mdx or the library, which is what is used to convert Mdx syntax into JSX. And ultimately, this JSX that was first written in Mdx is compiled using tools like Babel or Webpack in order to be usable by the browser. So let's see Mdx in action by looking at this example. Like I said, at the simplest level, Mdx supports the ability to write JSX and Markdown. They themselves brand Mdx as JSX and Markdown for ambitious projects. And so the slides that you see here today are written in Mdx. And in this particular case, I'm using a library called Mdx Deck Live Code to show how you can use React components within Markdown files, also more specifically Mdx files, to add rich interactivity. So this whole presentation is an Mdx file. And here I have the plugin that I embedded, so it's a React component, and I can very quickly get responsive feedback in terms of whether or not the code that I'm typing in the editor is valid and whether or not it is updating. So if I take off of the H out of the H1, you'll see at the bottom of the screen there's an error message that appears saying that there's a syntax error within my code. So this opens the door for a lot of possibilities in terms of being able to create interactive content and give people feedback as to how certain changes that they make, for example, to how they're using a component from a component library, how will those changes impact how it renders without necessarily them having to do everything locally. Another way that you can use Mdx is to easily embed third-party content. So there is a library called Mdx Embed where you can embed things like CodePen or a tweet or a YouTube video or an egghead video directly into Mdx files. And in that case, you would use one of their components. So on this slide, I'm using the CodePen component and then passing in this unique ID that's associated with the CodePen, indicating with the tabs props which tabs I am interested in having rendered. And so this just makes it really easy to embed a lot of the different types of components that Mdx Embed supports. So you may still be wondering why Mdx. For me personally, I had started using Mdx after hearing other developers talk about the enhanced functionality that Mdx can add to websites. And I was especially interested after seeing some of the interactivity. I think some of the strongest selling points of Mdx is that it really does have enables a really strong authoring experience for technical contributors. You can seamlessly import React components into Mdx files, and it creates more engaging interactive content with the ease of componentized Markdown. So you may be wondering, how do you get started with using Mdx? So the first thing that you'll know is that if you have a project that already has Markdown files, in order for them to be fully supported by Mdx, those extensions should be changed to Mdx. So there are specific instructions on the Mdx doc site to set up with different bundlers and frameworks, including Webpack, Parcel, Next, Create React, Gatsby, and more. But at a bare minimum, you will need to use Mdx.js React and Mdx.js Mdx package, but I definitely encourage you to look specifically based on the frameworks that you're using to see what other requirements you may need. There's also instructions in the docs if you want to create your own custom tool to convert the Mdx appropriately. And then after you have Mdx available within your project, one of the first things I would recommend doing is using the Mdx provider to wrap around the layout page for where you're going to be rendering content from Mdx files. And so the Mdx provider allows you to pass the components you want to be available to all of the pages that are within the context, so that they're within the context in one place. And so in this example, I have a provider that's wrapping all of the content that uses this layout, and I am passing in the sign up and table of contents components to that provider. So any Mdx files that I write that are live within this Mdx provider can access the sign up component and the table of contents component without me having to explicitly import them directly within that lower level file. So I want to walk through an example of how I have used Mdx. So for my longer articles on my website, I like to create a table of content so that readers can have an overview of what to expect in a particular article. And so I liked adding these so much that I would manually write Markdown to render all of the content for the table of contents. And so I wanted to illustrate this diff of what a specific post that I had written looked like before and after I started using the Mdx table of contents. So before I was using the Mdx table of contents, like I said, I was writing out all of the Markdown manually. Once I had access to the table of contents component via Mdx, instead of writing out everything manually within this Markdown file, I'm importing a table of contents component into the Mdx file and passing in the table of contents into the table of contents from the prop into the table of contents component. So then that makes it so that it's actually rendering the content inside of the table of contents component that you saw in the previous slide. And so what does that look like? So I have this component table of contents. It has its own styling and it's expecting the headings, which I said are the table of contents from the props, which is something that on my site is available for each article as I'm using Gatsby. So I'm getting that data back from GraphQL, passing it from this specific article into this component, and then this component is mapping through each of the items in the heading and creating a new list item that links to the specific part of the page. So there's an anchor tag for each of these items. So then like I said earlier, I imported the table of contents component into the Mdx provider so that it was available to my article template. If you are using Gatsby, you'll know that in Gatsby applications, you also need to import an Mdx renderer, which is a React component from the Mdx Gatsby integration that takes compiled Mdx content and renders it. It's required if your Mdx content is coming from a GraphQL page query or static query. I also updated the post query here to pass in that table of contents into the available data. So you'll note here that there's a table of contents, and now that data is available within this props.data.mdx, and then which I'm passing it in as the post, and then for each for every time the blog post renders, the table of contents is getting pulled off of the data that was returned from this query, and then being passed along so that as needed, the table of contents can be rendered. And also, if you are interested in implementing this, it's helpful to know in Gatsby and other implementations of the table of contents, there's a depth variable that you can pass in to pull in deeper layers of subheadings. So for my use case, I only cared about the first layer, but the table of contents component, depending on how you write it, can be written to recursively render through all of the headings and subheadings. So you would just need to update the GraphQL query accordingly in order to render all of the content that is relevant. And so I wanted to show another example of how I use Mdx in an article. So I wrote an article about how to render relevant icons based on content. So on the homepage of my website, I have an article that I have a component that lists some of my more popular articles, which you can see here, and it will actually link out to the content. And so I wanted to show like how did I create these components, this component, in order to illustrate that. I thought it would be a great idea to actually import this component into the article that I was writing. So this is a fully functioning component. And in order to do that, I imported the article list component, and I hard-coded, passed in the slugs, tags, and titles for the articles that I wanted to render. So this syntax specifically is what's being used to render the above code. And so something that I did within my markdown file, which you can see over here, or Mdx file, is so I have my front matter, which I normally do for my Mdx files, and then I have just regular markdown, and then when you get to line 20, you'll see that I'm importing this article list component, and then here is where I was hard coding the values, which is what you would see rendered, and then down further below is I have some code fences to show readers what I rendered above with the code that was used to render what was above without actually rendering it. So using the code block so that the JSX isn't parsed as a component. And so like I mentioned, I imported this article list directly into the Mdx file, so I did not use it as an import inside of the Mdx provider, and so I would generally recommend, if there's a component that you are not going to keep reusing throughout a lot of different files, it makes more sense to import it directly, but if it's a component that you will be sharing through numerous files, like the table of contents, then I would recommend putting it in the provider so that it's available. And on the actual site, the article list component is getting the data passed in programmatically through a GraphQL query. But for the content that I wrote, I used hard-coded data as that, which just made it less complex to get the component to render. So let's walk through how I added this timer to this slideshow presentation that I am currently presenting. So we can pause the timer and we can restart the timer. So if we go into the code, you'll see that I have this Mdx provider, which has a countdown component. And so similar to what I was showing before, I'm passing in different components into the Mdx provider. So all of the components that I'm interested in passing into my slideshow are going into this MD components variable, and then I'm passing in the MD components as components to the Mdx provider, and then that is now available to my slideshow. So in my slideshow, I have this countdown notation where I'm referencing the countdown component that was imported into the Mdx provider. So let's see what that actual component, the countdown component, looks like. So please note that I got the code for this component from 30 seconds of code in Search Countdown, and this came up. So this code is also proof of concept that you don't have to write components necessarily a specific way to be usable within Markdown. So you'll see for the countdown component, it can take in hours, minutes, and seconds. So in my case, I just passed in as a default 1 minute and 30 seconds. But you can pass in like 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and then it was going to update the presentation so that the time that's displaying on the presentation is correlated with what was passed into the props. And also you will note that this is the MDX file, so there is Markdown and also the JSX that is what we're seeing. Let me comment that out. And so then if we go back to the slide and refresh, you'll see now that it's updated to 4 minutes and 30 seconds based on the update we just made. We could easily get rid of this extra character bracket that is appearing. So in summary, I wanted to illustrate that MDX can be used to provide a better developer experience and to enhance content that has been written in Markdown. And really the sky is the limit in terms of how MDX can be used to enhance Markdown, enhance content. So this is just really like scratching the surface of some of the things that you can accomplish with MDX and how. And so some of the resources that I think are helpful for people who are interested in looking more into MDX are the storybook documentation for if you're creating a component library. Their document project actually supports writing docs in MDX. So that's something cool to look into if you are writing a component library or looking for more ideas as to how to use MDX to illustrate how to use different pieces of code. There was also this great article by Nikki Millman on how they approached creating nested table of contents, and I thought it was really helpful to see how they approached the recursion. And then Prince.dev wrote a cool article about writing these call-out components with MDX, which is something I ended up doing on my site, and I think it's something you should check out if you're interested in seeing the different ways that you can extend MDX components to be more flexible, as well as I wanted to mention Mdx Embed, which I use within this presentation, as well as Next Mdx Stack, which is actually what this presentation was built with. And then a cool plugin that I've been meaning to use more is Prism React Render. So definitely, I would say those are good places to check out in addition to the official MDX documentation. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation today. I hope you learned something new about MDX, and I would love to hear on Twitter what your experience with MDX ends up being like.
Thank you so much for A, the talk, B, being so fantastic, and C, coming in for this Q&A.
Thank you.
People are asking me to personally hype them up. For you, free 99 any day of the week, I will be your personal hype man.
I appreciate it.
So one of our first questions is actually coming from Kurt. What are some of your favorite custom components you've seen in the wild? I know you went over a couple there with Prince's call out and some of the MDX Next or the MDX deck stuff. Is there any other custom components you've seen that really blow your mind?
So I really like Josh W. Humu. They have on their website where they teach web development, they have a lot of examples where if they're teaching a concept, they'll have like the actual component embedded inside so you can see what it actually looks like in practice. So they have an article about how to add sound effects when someone clicks on a component, and you can actually experience what does that sound like in what's the overall experience within the article. And I've also seen really cool implementations of which I had mentioned like in my presentation, that how you can have a live code editor as well. So Formidable, they have an open source library called React Live, where someone can quickly like edit code and then see how that changes the output, which is also something that Josh does a lot on their website. So those are like some of the things that I like, just like being able to get more like hands-on in terms of knowing like how something works. So for me, the most, I think, interesting custom components are ones that are being used to like teach and educate. So not necessarily like a specific component.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the coolest pieces of MDX is it really supercharges education, right? Like there's so many cool things that you can do with the content that you pull in. And I think one of my favorites is the scrolly telling idea where, there's this kind of live, updating component where, it gets fed data as you scroll down. I think that's really one of my favorites for sure. One of our next questions is coming in from Linda. What was the first thing you used MDX for, and how did you get started with it?
Yes. So when I first started using MDX, it was within the context of a Gatsby website. So I did some research to figure out like what is the process to convert from just using Markdown to using MDX, and a lot of it was like switching out plugins. I actually have a talk on Egghead about the process of how I migrated to MDX, and so in terms of doing that, I made some updates, like I said, to the plugin, and then I was able to start using MDX. And one of the first components that I made was like borrowing a slider component from another website, so that I could just like test out like what does MDX look and feel like. And then after that, I moved on to upgrading my code snippets, so making it so that they had like more information available for users than what I could default have like with regular code blocks outside of MDX. So those were some of the first things that I did with MDX on my site.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people's kind of first soiree into MDX was within the Gatsby ecosystem. So it's really cool that it really started to catch on from there. And now you see it out in the wild from, within all of the ecosystems. And it's definitely something that I've, put a lot of thought and time behind. It's definitely one of the cooler technologies to start to get involved with. And it doesn't always have to be for education, right? It can be how you source your blog. It can be how you source kind of any kind of, on the fly content can, come straight from Markdown and fit right into the ecosystem you need it to.
Definitely.
And then we have, they're pouring in now. Okay, we got another one from Kurt. What is the first thing you used MDX for, and how did you get started with it? I think we already kind of answered that for, with Gatsby. Another question we have here, because the sky's the limit with MDX, mixing many components, do you have any experience with pitfalls using it? Things developers starting with it should avoid doing?
That's a good question. I guess I would be careful about like if you are using the MDX provider, like being mindful of like what you're passing in so that you're not having a lot of unnecessary imports. Potentially you could have some like, I guess, conflicts between if you're using, I'm not sure like what happens if you use with MDX, you can like override default things within Markdown. So like if you have a pre-tag or a new paragraph, you could have it so that there's a custom component that renders every single time that type of content is created. So potentially you could have like conflicts, I would say, if you have like a custom component that's supposed to interact with the same thing that you already have like other logic for. But I would assume that that would probably be pretty obvious like as you're developing. But I'm not sure like what other like problems someone might run into that are specific to MDX that you might not encounter. You probably encounter similar issues, I would think, with React.
Yeah, I think one of the only like off the top of my head things that I can think of that I've run into recently, I was sourcing MDX from Sanity, or I was sourcing Markdown from Sanity, and they had the code blocks set up. And when it came to process it into the MDX, there was a missing ending tag in one of the code blocks, and it was trying to parse it into the MDX, and it was failing because it was saying that there was a missing final tag to throw into the custom code block that we were getting. So having something in mind to kind of check and make sure that your code blocks are set up and that it won't kind of break while it's getting transpiled into MDX has been one of the big kind of stumble blocks I've hit.
Oh, yeah, that definitely is true. I know for me, I have had issues with like syntax. And I ended up using Next Mdx deck for my slides. So all the slides I presented were built with Mdx. But before that, I was using, I believe, Mdx deck, and I was having a lot of issues because the hot reloading was kind of finicky.
Yeah.
And then I would have like syntax issues, and like it doesn't fail gracefully. So that is definitely something that I think comes with using Mdx, of just like being cognizant of that. But depending on your environment, it may be easier for you to navigate that. Like I found with Next, I've had like pretty good errors if I do have syntax issues, so that I can like get to the root of it and solve them quickly.
Definitely. Cool. So I think that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you all for throwing some questions to Monica. Monica, again, phenomenal talk. Thank you so much for joining me and you know, being available to answer these questions. Definitely find Monica after the conference. Follow her on Twitter. She is rad. Definitely reach out if you have any more questions. Monica, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.